So we're going to just really pass it over to Shaun to dive into some amazing examples. And we want to encourage you to consider questions. So consider a question from the perspective of your role in your organization, whether supplier, purchaser, or so forth. We are going to facilitate, we have over, I think, a half an hour set aside to really dive into conversation. So think of a question that you might have for Shaun, tied to the work that he's going to share. And we really want to open it up and have a conversation today. So be certain that we have time set aside for that, and Jenna's going to facilitate it. But I'm going to actually just pass it over to Shaun now to take it away, and I'll stop sharing my screen.
Jimmy Kimmel said that in the midst of the pandemic, the most common phrase of 2020 is "you're on mute," and I was on mute. Sorry. Nice to be with you. I've been looking forward to connecting. A little bit about me, I think, before I start, is I helped to found a nonprofit in the inner city of Winnipeg, where I live, in 2006. So I am not any more clever than any of you. I though have 14, 15 years of experience working in the system and have learned an awful lot along the way. I've learned a lot about how solutions, I think, are actually more entrepreneurial than I originally thought. I originally thought that kind of government was in the problem solving business. I've now realized they're in the problem managing business. I see employers, institutions, universities, colleges, government departments as playing a very different role than I originally thought in terms of solving what are some of Canada's biggest problems. For me, living in Winnipeg, about almost 20% of our population is now Indigenous. So some of this is coming through that lens, and in that sense, it's a Canadian conversation, but it doesn't really matter when it comes to social enterprises what the color of people's skin is. Like the fact that people are struggling, or the fact that we have bad environmental outcomes, are really the causes of bad systems. And so the whole game at play here is how do we change these systems? Or put in another way, poverty is not about poor people. It's about the failure of systems that they're interacting with. So one of the big surprises then for me was that how I come to see this movement is really about turning government from a funder into a customer. And just going to pull up the slides better here. When we look at what social innovation is all about, we can see that it's, for me, turning government from a funder into a customer. It doesn't mean that it's always government. It just means that people who are wanting to be helpful. And so I like to think of it this way. The reason is because most of the work that social enterprises and nonprofits do, the financial beneficiary is actually government. It could also mean other things, and I define government very broadly. It could include institutions that receive government supports. But if we're not finding ways to capture that value that we're providing to government or to its institutions, then we're really giving away what is our most lucrative outcome. So this whole movement you can call social innovation, and uh, there's a lot of different titles to what social innovation is. But for me, if you're coming at it from a government perspective or from a policy perspective, it's really about making it easy for problem solvers. And right now, it's very tough going for problem solvers. This conversation around social procurement is about making it easy for problem solvers. And I like to talk to people about social innovation in the same way with technical innovation. So most of you will have a smartphone within arm's reach, and the smartphone, 3 years prior to its introduction, 2 years, 6 months even, people wouldn't have anticipated the massive market adoption that was about to take place. And it was because of the convergence of a whole bunch of things at the same time around technical innovation. We've seen that if you're interested in a fascinating evening of entertainment, go on YouTube and Google a guy named Tony Seba, S-E-B-A, talking about technical innovation. He's never thought about social innovation before. I linked the two, but he talks about convergence. Like in 1911 or 1902, there was a picture of the Easter parade in New York City, and it's all horses. And about 5 years later, a picture from the same vantage point, and it's all cars. Well, what happened that there was such massive market adoption? And with social innovation, it's a convergence of a bunch of things at the same time. So we have social enterprises, which are a very disruptive business model, conversations around reconciliation, which are very important. We have foundations, which have billions of dollars in assets, realizing that only a very small portion of their money is being made available to the problem-solving sector in the form of grants. And so they're beginning to offer their endowments to social purpose businesses, which are pretty cool. We have young people that are wanting to do something with their careers, which is aligned with their values. And we have governments that are exhausted with managing these expensive social problems. So when we see all these things converging, what it is saying to me is that this thing called social innovation, it's about to explode. And I can see it already. Things are very different now than they were only a few years ago. And how we understand the tools of social innovation are critically important. So the last book I wrote, called The Beautiful Bailout, talks a lot about community-driven outcomes purchasing, which I'm going to touch on later today in a few minutes. But the book I wrote before that, called An Army of Problem Solvers, focuses more on social procurement as we traditionally understand it. And so I like this infographic from one of my books talking about social procurement. And if you're a purchaser, if you're a procurement officer, or you're embedded in government, you look at this chart and say, well, we're buying all kinds of things right now. In fact, the three levels of government purchase $50 billion worth of goods and services on an annual basis. Governments are very good at buying stuff. What they can do is continue to buy those exact same goods and services that they're buying now, but if they engage social enterprises, they're getting these additional benefits at no added cost. And if you're looking at this from a perspective of a nonprofit or a perspective of a social enterprise, you're actually not asking government for special treatment. You're not asking government, as it's defined broadly, to pay more. You're actually asking them to get more value. And so this chart kind of leads you to how it is you can outmuscle the private sector to offer goods and services to these big institutions that are already buying goods and services. So this is why my books are endorsed by the Chambers of Commerce. And they're also endorsed by the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives. So you have like people from the left part of the political spectrum and from the right saying, well, this makes total sense. And why you have governments all across the country are beginning to come out with social procurement policies because they're trying to leverage these benefits that are represented here in green. So if you're, let's take, for example, Manitoba Housing that I'm going to talk about here shortly, you want to get your trade services supplied by social enterprises because social enterprises are going to hire your tenants. If you own Manitoba Housing, which is in the case of Government of Manitoba, you want to have procurement policies so that you can reduce incarceration, which is $80,000 a year per person, or reduce the number of kids in care. What does it have to do with kids in care? When people start making good decisions and can gain access to the labor market, they're more likely to make efforts to get their kids back. So if governments across Canada, as they're broadly defined, were to just say, you know, we're going to have policies so that we end up with 2% of our goods and services supplied to us at no extra cost by social enterprises who are hiring people with barriers to employment, it would be employment generated for 15,000 Canadians who currently don't have access to the labor market now. So these aren't new jobs, these 15,000. They're just jobs that are done in a way that has extreme interest to governments because governments are really struggling with the cost of managing these super expensive social problems. So this infographic says a lot. If you're a purchaser, why you'd want to do it and how you do it. You know, there's this myth that social procurement is going to cost the people who are buying, departments that are buying more money. It's not true. You just say we're not willing to pay more, but we would like to leverage extra benefits. So a university or Georgian college, why would they want to do this? Well, first of all, you're participating in Canadian society, so you want to have contributions towards things like reconciliation. You might be able to do procurement in a way that's supporting many of your programs, like your entrepreneurship programs. Wouldn't it be cool if you had a social enterprise that was offering, operating as a pop-up coffee shop Monday to Friday mornings from 7 to 11? Or what about supporting Indigenous students so that when they leave, they've got an anchor customer that is buying their goods and services. Another cool thing about this infographic is it really shifts the conversation towards outcomes, because when our social enterprises do work for Manitoba Housing, we don't get paid unless we deliver the outcome, and we do it on time, and we do it at market rates, and we do it at market quality. So governments like it because the risk is kind of transferred away from them, and they only are able to pay for outcomes. They can also explain it very easily to the private sector. It's to say, well, you know, if you want this business, we're happy for you to bid on it, but you've got to be able to deliver these additional benefits. So how we see social enterprises then is this kind of a special type of business, and that often they're incorporated as a nonprofit. I'm going to talk a bit about that briefly, but doesn't have to be incorporated as a nonprofit. But the point is that the business is oriented towards solving these social problems, but we're also using these market tools. And so one of these market tools is social procurement. I talk on Beautiful Bailout 4 different market tools, but one of the most powerful ones is social procurement, which is what we're mostly talking about today. Okay, so in the Winnipeg context, here we go. So Build started as a government-funded nonprofit, we quickly realized that we're going to be able to expand our mandate significantly by being a contractor. And we hire people like Chris and David here, both with massive criminal records. Chris, for example, was arrested 26 times before he came to build. And he said the only thing that was going to stop him, and Chris and David here insulated this particular basement. And you can see Build's staff photo. This is a major operation and about 100 people at a time. And most of the folks in that staff photo would come to us with criminal records, with no driver's license, with no work experience, and no trades-based math. So really folks that as regular employers would be crazy to hire. But we actually use the fact that we do business differently to outmuscle the private sector to get these contracts with, in this case, public housing. Now, to go back to this for a minute, when you're nonprofit, you're actually often, not all the time, often more entrepreneurial than if you're incorporated as a for-profit, because you'll find the procurement officers will find it easier to do business directly with you if you are a nonprofit. It's actually easier to gain access to the unique selling proposition that is the secret sauce of what it is that you're doing. Different from a lot of nonprofits, there's a lot of accountability built into Build. So when people are hired to work at Build, it's a job. There's a time clock. You got to be there on time. If you're not, then there's interventions are taken to ask, well, what is the case? So really preparing people for the labor market. Here's a bunch of Build-like entities across the country. Note community builders in Barrie and Elly, you might not be aware, but community builders recently started doing work in Sudbury. And they also recently changed their governance model from a for-profit company to a nonprofit and found that that was a more entrepreneurial model for them. So you can Google community builders. You can also Google Building Up in Toronto, buildingup.ca. They are about $6 million a year using this business model, which is pretty cool. And it's a recognition that there's two kinds of money. There's all the money that's being spent on a regular basis, and then there's that little wee bit of money that nonprofits are usually struggling to get. And so what this game is around social innovation is moving from the small amount of money into the big amount of money and using social procurement in this case to do it. And what you'll find as you're interacting with these systems, the problem again isn't the people, or the problem isn't the people. And this is a lineup inside the Social Enterprise Center in Winnipeg of people who are applying for 8 jobs at Build. And they are in the lineup because they know we'll hire them because they have no work experience, or they have a criminal record, or because they don't have a driver's license, and so on. So what we need is to find ways to respond to this incredible demand. And the good news is that poverty actually doesn't have any causes. Poverty is actually the lack of prosperity. And so if we want to get rid of poverty, we have to promote prosperity. So here's a bit more about the Build's model, and then I'm going to talk briefly about how Build is interacting with Manitoba Housing. But there's 2 kinds of revenue that come in. You can see that represented on the left. The blue is funding, and the green is contracts that Build has with, for example, with Manitoba Housing. And so in the beginning, I was kind of under the mistaken view that, well, we'll just be a profitable contractor and we'll use our profits to pay for the stuff that other contractors don't do. And what we're finding was that was just too hard. Like, you do need some revenue to pay for the things that most contractors wouldn't do. So that's sort of represented there in blue. I'm going to show you in a few minutes a different way other than funding of getting that revenue that is needed. But the point is, what's represented there in blue in the pie chart is the secret sauce of social enterprises. That's what makes us special. And we need to find ways to value what it is that does, because that funding is really what helps people participate in the labor market that otherwise might be incarcerated or on social assistance or have their kids in care. They're interacting with government at very expensive levels. And so that's the part that makes us special. That's the part that makes universities or colleges want to do business with social enterprises, because we can do these things that the private sector cannot. Now, the blue part there on the right, that's what we use that blue money for, is focusing our activities around in Winnipeg, Indigenous culture. We bring in a lot of elders, but we also do financial literacy, driver's training. We offer work experience. We do trades-based tutoring, all of these things that help people be successful. And so the revenue model is represented. And notice the ratio, in this case, 3 to 1. If you're hiring people that are really need a lot of support, that ratio will change. But at Build, it's approximately 3 to 1. Or if you're hiring people that don't need a lot of support, it might be 9 to 1. But it's rare to see a successful social enterprise that's doing it based all on contracts. And I think that's the main point that I wanted to make with this slide. Now, how Manitoba Housing, as procurement officers, they're buying $6 million a year of trade services with several social enterprises in Manitoba. So the fact they're doing that enables us to have 200 people on our payroll at most times throughout Manitoba. So that's pretty cool. And doesn't cost them money. And these are, a lot of these 200 will end up in the private sector. So the ongoing impact is far more than 200, maybe a couple thousand over the last 5 years, for example. But it involves stepping outside of the traditional procurement process. And the way that works is it usually how governments determine the market rate is they'll put out a tender and say, we want this building built, and the lowest price from the most qualified bidder is going to get the job. And what social procurement recognizes is that in order to extract these additional benefits, the procurement must be done differently, because social enterprises, we're hiring people that are entry level to the labor market. So we don't want to build big buildings. We want to do the drywall in the building, or we want to do the painting or the cleaning or the garbage removal. We want to do those entry level jobs which prepare people for the labor market. So what we need procurement officers to do is to break the job down and say, well, we're wondering, social enterprise X, if you'd be interested in doing the drywalling. And then you negotiate. What happens is that there's an agreement negotiated on the drywalling. Now, the temptation as a procurement officers is, because this is what they know how to do, is that, we'll put out a tender for social enterprises to bid on the drywalling job. But the problem with that is that we don't compete against each other. It's awkward for us because we want everyone to be successful, and competing against each other makes no sense in our world. But there's other ways of determining the market price. So it's not hard to know on a per foot basis how much it costs to drywall a building. So find some other way to determine the market price and offer that market price to social enterprises and see if they can do it for that amount. The tendering process, it's nowhere is it mandated that the tendering process must happen. There needs to be a process to determine market value, and I'm telling you how Manitoba Housing does it. We've worked out with them a menu. So to replace a kicked-in door is X amount. to put 2 coats of paint on a 5 per square foot is an X amount. To remove garbage to the garbage dump is X amount per load. So we're able to engage Manitoba Housing not through the traditional procurement process, but through this other direct negotiated process, which is easier for Manitoba Housing, and they actually quite like it because it's easier to kind of keep track of things and to know what each part of it is costing. So so I think that's my advice to procurement officers is go to social enterprises, ask them what it is they can do on a job, and then try to find alternative market price mechanisms to find out what to pay them and negotiate a contract based on that market rate. Knowing that you're not just getting the market price, you're also extracting these additional benefits, which is why you wouldn't tender it, is because most of the people who are going to bid on that job are not going to be able to offer these additional benefits. So it's really a process of moving procurement from lowest price to best value. And who wouldn't want to buy something and get the best value out of it? And it's not about special treatment, it's about fair competition. And it's about social enterprises not giving away our outcomes. And it's about procurement officers leveraging these additional benefits on behalf of whomever they're spending the money. So it's actually kind of a nice marrying of meeting up in the marketplace. So back to Scotland just for a minute. This is a fascinating picture. So this is at lunchtime. It's at a social enterprise near Glasgow. And as you can see there, it's an electronics recycling enterprise called Haven Industries. Haven Industries is all over the UK. And this is a management team there, but you can't get a job at Haven Industries unless you have a criminal record. Now, those electronics that you're looking at, I asked them, who's your biggest customer? Listen to this. The biggest customer is the Scotland Police. So the police are procuring a service called electronics recycling in such a manner so as to reduce crime. I don't know about you, but that makes total sense to me. And they've got other social enterprises who hire people with criminal records doing other work for them across the UK. And the reason why the police got into this is because the government of Scotland said that, you know, basically, if you want a government contract, you're going to have to show how you're partnering with a social enterprise, because we're tired of paying all these costs of managing these expensive social programs, and we want to leverage these additional benefits. So in Scotland, there's 5,600 social enterprises. Half of them hire people with barriers to employment. 2/3 are led by women, and the average CEO of those companies makes 2.5 times as much as the average worker. Now, in Canada, our biggest employers, virtually none of them hire people with barriers to employment. Only 2 out of 100 are led by women, and the CEO makes 209 times as much as the average worker, and that's before stock options. So why, if you're government or in the governmental sector or in the institutional sector, you can see the value of doing business with social enterprises, addressing our chronic issues like income inequality, gender inequality, and these huge segments of society, i.e. refugees, i.e. Indigenous folks who don't have access to the labor market, and leveraging all these additional benefits. And so Scotland is kind of ahead of the game on this idea of social procurement, but you can see it coming. And here's the cities, for example, that have social procurement policies now. And I don't know if Barrie has one or not, but there's 12 municipalities on Vancouver Island, including the city of Victoria, the city of Vancouver, Edmonton, Calgary, Saskatoon, Toronto. They all have social procurement policies attempting to leverage these additional benefits. Now, I haven't seen a great social procurement policy yet, but they have them, and that they'll be improved. So you can see, read more about social procurement in an army of problem solvers. On the right, you can read more about how to start a social enterprise. I asked people who have done it for feedback on a list of 10 steps that we developed in Winnipeg. And then what I'm about to do is to talk about what I promote in the Beautiful Bailout, which is not just selling government things that they're already buying, but selling them these amazing social outcomes, which they desperately want, but that our sector is not currently providing. So before I move on to introducing just talking about social procurement in this slightly different way, using an example from Barrie, I just wonder if there's any questions or comments.
Hi there, Shaun. Thanks. I've really been looking forward to this. I enjoyed your 2 books very much. I work
Nice.
I run a small museum in the municipality of Grey Highlands, and I work with a team in economic development. And social procurement makes a lot of sense. In a former life, I ran construction companies in Toronto, and I participated in the bid and spec process for construction projects. So that was everything from tenant changes all the way up to large P3 projects like hospitals. And the one point that you made was encouraging procurement officers to break down big tenders.
Yeah.
Because a social enterprise might not be able to, it's a big ask, obviously, to have a social enterprise build a building, but to have a social enterprise do painting as part of the scope, right?
Yeah.
So the thing is, in construction, there are levels, as you know. So a tender is put out to it's responded to typically by a general contractor.
Yeah.
That general contractor has relationships with their subcontractors. Each level of subcontractor or each division of labor would be bid upon by subcontractors.
Yeah.
So what I'm asking is, or rather what I'm putting forward is, in the bid and spec process, if you're looking at putting up a building, the procurement officer is not the one necessarily making the decision. They're not making the decision. It's just put out to the GC.
Right.
How do you get a GC to which is a for-profit enterprise, unless it's say building up or another one of these entities? How do you get traditional for-profit GCs to start using social enterprises as subs? And then doesn't that also start to create that starts to create competition at that level?
Yeah. So let me first say, when you said museum, I hadn't thought about it before, but I think there's some pretty cool things that museums can do, ironically, to be more entrepreneurial, like, using that space or the activity around talking about history and culture and engaging society in a different way. I'd be interested in thinking about that a little more. It's kind of cool.
So on that note, I encourage you to check out southgreymuseum.ca. We are all about that, and we've been doing. I didn't know that there was a word called social procurement, and when my boss was like, "You should probably read this guy's book," and then when I started working with Elly and Senko, it was pretty refreshing. But wherever possible, we do social procurement. We actually have some. We've helped local kids start businesses, and it's been great.
Nice. I don't see it in the chat, Robert, the link.
Oh, I'll pop in the link now. Cheers.
Thank you. I'll use it as an example. Anyways, so yeah, what you're going to learn, is it in 2 weeks, Elly, when Buy Social Canada comes? Yeah, she'll talk about this thing called community benefit clauses. And so the original tender may say something to the general contractor, 15% of the labor hours on the job must be performed by social enterprises. You go figure out what that looks like to you. Or they could mandate that, the drywalling is going to be done by social enterprises, and just say to them, you've got to sort it out. But it does need to be triggered for sure at the top as a mechanism to value what it is that social enterprises do. I'm fascinated with, this will sound off topic at first, but it's not. The Ontario Energy Board says to, for example, natural gas providers, we'll give you your 4% rate of return, but you have to show us that you're going to help 100,000 low-income families reduce their utility bills. So you could actually build into the procurement contract, bonuses, for example, or we'll pay you what we agreed to, but as a condition, you've got to do this. So, but whoever's paying has to make it clear to the general contractor that this is part of their job. If you don't make it clear, then you have this big argument about whether or not you should do it. If you mandate it at that level, then the argument is over. It turns into a discussion about the best way to do it. So, the Olympics, when they were held in the UK, they went out and found all kinds of social enterprises. They're delivering the flowers, they were doing the cleaning, they were doing the security work, but they started with the social enterprise sector and said, what is it that you can do? And there's a big long list of stuff that they intended to buy. And the social enterprises, we can do that, we can do this, we can do this. So it was kind of a pairing of the two. And I'm describing how Manitoba Housing did it, but you're going to hear in a couple weeks about these community benefit clauses, which are also important. And I love that you brought that up because I probably should have talked about it before. And thanks for the website. I'm looking forward to learning more about it.
Right
cool,
on,
Robert,
thank you.
an interesting background that you have. That's neat. Did you know that Elly was like a friggin' welder or something like that?
It's true. It's a true story.
Oh, I didn't, but Elly and I both have a passion for weird houses.
Okay.
It's true.
I agree. I also really agree with what you said, by the way, Shaun, on the idea of convergence. In the study of history, what humans do is over time, we begin to aggregate things. And it's the combination of different things. I have a quote in my book from that I wrote in my notebook from Steve Jobs a few days ago. And he said, creativity is just combining things. I also get the feeling we're perched right on the edge of a critical mass in this next turn.
Right.
And the thing is, I think everyone agrees, like if history says one thing, it shows that having inequalities is bad for stability, because inequalities get worse over time until we do something. And by because we have so much technology and we've reached such a critical mass with so many different things, and so many things are beginning to combine,
right,
it is incumbent upon us, capital U, us, to start developing a paradigm to ensure that we don't have, say, this, like in the context of like, big businesses with big paid CEOs, that kind of stuff, that we don't just have the tokenism of like a charitable donation and a tax write-off, that we can nip these problems in the bud. Because the fact is, like, do you want a big incarceration system, or do you want people to feel productive and feel like they can contribute? Like, what's going to give you a more stable society? So I love when you said the community benefit clause of 15%. By having something open source like that, it encourages the individuals who are involved in that very specific process, which requires all sorts of knowledge and experience. It encourages them to basically find their own solutions. And in that way, you're going to grow things organically. Like that Scotland example makes total sense. It's to the benefit of the police that ex-cons are having good employment, because then the police don't have to police those ex-cons as much.
Yeah, and the general contractor's under a lot of pressure to get the building done on time and to specs, and so she is then able to say to the social enterprise, well, you prove to me that you're capable of doing this job, so let me meet your supervisors, your tradespeople, and show me references from past work and tell me how you're going to go about doing this. Because if you can't convince me of those things, then I'm not going to hire you. So, but it kind of leaves it up to them to figure out which social enterprise is going to best meet their task. So it's adding a task onto their job. So their job is like, build this building, locate it here, hook it up to sewer and water and electricity and so on. And then there's another box is that, it makes sure 15% of the hours on the job are done by social enterprises. So it just kind of adds onto their to-do list. And it's just really important not to leave the decision of whether to do it with them. It just turns into a disaster. They need to be told to do it, but to give the flexibility to get it done in a way that allows them to do their job.
Right on. Culture eats strategy for breakfast.
Nice.
So I am currently working / volunteering my life in two nonprofits that I'm trying to, both of them are at a point where we're trying to figure out how we're going to grow. And one in particular, I've been thinking about trying to shift towards social enterprise. So my question is, how do you start that shift? From what you're saying, I'm thinking that you have to start maybe with who you want to benefit and then work backwards towards like, what could they do, or what could we do? And then look towards the government agencies that you might want to work with or target. Is that how you?
So the difference between a normal business and a social enterprise is that the social enterprise is wanting to solve a problem. So it's important to state what is the problem we're trying to solve. So for me, living in Winnipeg, connecting the people who most need the work with the work that most needs to be done. So then it's a question of what's the best widget to support the particular folks that I'm wanting to focus on. So at Build, we hire people that are very functional, that also have criminal records, no driver's licenses, no work experience, and so on. If somebody comes in, they have FASD, or they have mental health issues, or they're addicted to meth or whatever, we can't, the social enterprise isn't set up to help that particular segment of society. There are social enterprises, and I can guarantee there's social enterprise strategies that can work with those folks, but Build is not. So what is the widget that is best suited there? Okay, so I can say, well, these are with people with criminal records, they're mostly men. They'll probably be interested in working in the trades. Now, when women come in to Build, they get bumped up to the top of the wait list because we're also trying to hire more women because they're underrepresented in the workplace. But so the widget is important. So you just kind of leave it there, like you have a list of things that the widgets would work for. But then you want to go and identify some customers that are going to buy the widget. And what is it that they're buying? Okay, so, we think that the museum would be really interested. They have a big construction job going on. I mean, I keep thinking about construction, or they have a big event a couple times a year they need security at, or so, I don't know what it is. But then, like, we know the museum would be interested in our services for whatever reason. And then you kind of list what they buy on a regular basis and the widgets that would make sense to you. And what's going to happen is that there's something's going to pop out that's on both lists. Then the next thing is to go to that purchaser and say, first of all, we don't want you to pay more. We don't want you to wait longer. We don't want you to receive services that are less than what you otherwise would. But we do want you we offer these additional benefits that our competitors would not. Can we talk about it? And that's the way to get social procurement discussions going. But yeah, what is the problem? And then what is the best widget what are some widgets that would work? And then flip over to the procurement side and what are they buying? What is it that we can deliver? And that's really important. Now, in the procurement side, you're going to see there's two different kinds. We'll just call them civil servants, but people inside the bureaucracy. And in the beautiful bailout, there's two different kinds of people. So there's what I call Indian agents. So people who are doubling down on the existing system and say, everything is great. The solar panels, we got them up on the band office. Well, yeah, but what was the company that put the solar panels on the band office? And what about the other 499 buildings on the res? It's like, oh, well, we'll get more funding and we'll eventually do those. No, you're not going to. It's not going to happen. But so you have these Indian agents that are like, there's something wrong with poor people. That's the issue here. We're just managing this problem. But you also have these really cool people that I call entrepreneurs. And they're people who are changing the system from the inside. Find an entrepreneur, because they're going to, and I talk a bit about how they go about doing their job in the beautiful bailout, because they're going to go to their bosses and say, hey, in our mission statement, it says that we're supposed to be doing something about reconciliation. I got something for you that isn't going to cost us any more money and will really make us look good, or enhance the experience for students, or reduce our costs in other areas, or whatever. So so it's a bit of a process. But one mistake that people often make is that they have a solution and they got a solution looking for a problem, and that doesn't work. That's why a lot of people say, oh, the problem that what we need in remote First Nations is these sea containers where you can grow a lot of food. They want to come and say it's a technological problem, and it's almost never a technological solution. We got all the technology we need now to solve our problems. The problem is, how is the money moving and the systems that are generating these terrible outcomes that we're currently seeing. So I don't know, Jen, if that's helpful at all, but the fun part about the process is that you can walk into a conversation about procurement and be able to say, we can do all this stuff that you want, and we'll also be able to give you these additional benefits which our competitors will not be able to do. In the Problem Solver's Companion, it's got Mark Sobrano's story from building up and how he started building up. This is a $6 million a year contractor. Mistake number two that people make is that, we're gonna have a $6 million a year contractor. No, you're gonna have a social enterprise in the beginning that's gonna do one job. And you don't need a full-time plumber to do to do that one job of retrofitting an apartment block with low-flow toilets or efficient toilets and shower heads. You need to hire a plumber for that job. You don't need a truck to do that job. You need to borrow a truck from your sister. You don't need a full-time bookkeeper. You can get another nonprofit to put that job in as a cost center embedded in that already existing nonprofit. You don't need to incorporate to do that one job. An existing nonprofit can do that one job as a cost center in their existing business. You don't need a board. An existing nonprofit with a board can kind of be the governance for this one project. But the point is, once you start, then this weird thing happens where the damn thing starts talking to you, the social enterprise. And you listen to it and it'll tell you, it's like, we need our own bank account. We need our own board. We need our own building. We need our own full-time staff. And the process of being an entrepreneur is responding to the business as it's telling you what it is that it needs.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense. I think it's like, so a problem like childcare, I think it's you keep having to ask the question, and kind of back it out a little bit. I think you're saying to get to something that is a small tangible thing you can start with, and then it will grow from there potentially, right?
Yeah. So
week you'll find you'll find how the solution fits.
So childcare is an interesting example because I'm going to show you here in a minute how we can begin to think of it as a social enterprise. But usually childcare, I mean, you could think of it as a social enterprise, I guess, because generally they get paid on a per kid per day basis. So it's like that per se, but the widget is you're pretty focused on looking after kids and keeping them safe and engaged. But I wouldn't normally think of a childcare center as a social enterprise. I would think of it as a nonprofit, and lovely, but not really engaging in market activities how we're used to think about market activities.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Are you guys interested in a little taste of how to sell the secret sauce of social enterprises, the thing called the outcomes, the stuff, the reason why we exist? Can I move on to that? Just I have a few slides that they're kind of out of the beautiful bailout. I was sitting in the mayor's office, Mayor Lehman's office in Barrie, after a Senko event. And the mayor says to me, yeah, we have 400 of our homeless people are regularly in contact with emergency services. And I'm like, well, okay, I don't come from that sector. What does that mean? He said, well, these 400 folks, each of them will see emergency services 43 times a year. Holy shit. Well, how much is that? 43 times what? Is, well, on average, it works out to $3,000 per contact. So 43 times a year times $3,000 per contact times 400 people. Wow. That's a massive amount of money that the system is using to manage this problem called homelessness. So what's emerging, and what I talk about in the beautiful bailout, is this tool that's kind of, it's social procurement, but not selling government things they're already buying. So the innovation here is selling them things they desperately need and want, which is a reduction in workload. So in Barrie, and some of you will be familiar with this, and I mean, this is somewhat common across Canada, is that there's super cool supportive housing projects where you can take people who are experiencing homelessness, offer them a home and a whole bunch of supports. And it's super expensive, but it's a fraction of the cost of what's happening now. So this Lucy's Place, was funded. It took a lot of work to line up the funding, but we need a dozen of these things, and we need it now. in each city like Barrie across the country, and in towns we need one of them, and in Toronto we need 1,000 of them. So funding ain't going to do that. Funding is a very colonial tool. It is about compliance. It's not attached to outcomes. So are there other kinds of money other than funding, or other ways of doing things that can help resolve these issues? And as it turns out, social procurement is the way to it. This thing about turning government from a funder into a customer. So with Build, we're selling government things they're already buying and muscling out the private sector to get to extract some value out of the secret sauce. This is selling the secret sauce, but here's what we're selling, and nowhere on this slide does it mention homelessness, because governments have made it perfectly clear they're not interested in reducing homelessness. If they were, they would have done it a long time ago. They're not interested in employment on First Nations. They're not interested in climate change. They're not interested in reducing diet-related diseases. They're not interested in reducing kids in care. None of those things matter to them, but they are very interested in reducing the costs associated with all of those things. So here's what we're selling right now. We're negotiating procurement agreements with these systems. We're going to sell to the Barrie Police a reduction in arrests and dispatch. The police chief in Barrie, she tells us, Chief Greenwood, there's 20 people that they see 500 times a year. So don't tell me that ending homelessness is costly. I don't want to hear about it, because it's the opposite. But nonprofits go, you look, the Toronto End Homelessness Association asks people in Toronto, for the cost of a latte a day, would you agree to end homelessness in Toronto? No, that's totally the wrong question, because problem solving is cheaper than the problems. We should be going, say, for a free latte a day, would you be interested in ending homelessness in Toronto? That's the question. And then when we begin to ask that question, we're stepping into our power. Because this is what social enterprises and nonprofits can do, is that we can reduce workload for the police, for the healthcare system, for the justice system. But again, we're not selling them a reduction in homelessness. We're selling to them what supportive housing does, which is, in the case of the justice ministries, reducing the number of nights in jail or reducing court appearances. And this is what the procurement model looks like. We sign contracts. Well, let me take a step back, because I think this relates to social procurement as we were just talking about it. So if I'm a contractor, and Robert, you can confirm this, and I've got a tender to build a bridge. So I've got an outcomes contract with government. The contract is, you build the bridge, here's the specifications, and when it's done, we'll give you $20 million. That's what the outcomes contract says. And then they take that to their investors and say, here's the contract. I need $15 million to build this $20 million bridge. They get the financing based on their reputation, based on them having done projects similar in the past. They've got to obviously show the financing people that they can do the work. All right. Then they build the bridge with that money, and then then at 6 o'clock, the bridge is built, and then when the bridge is built, the government civil servant comes along, and she's an engineer with a clipboard and says, yeah, you met all the specifications, here's your money. So it's paid afterwards. With nonprofits, the money comes up front, and it's really about compliance, not about outcomes. So governments are super good at buying stuff. So what we're doing is taking what we do in the social enterprise and nonprofit sector, but using that way of government procurement to sell these amazing outcomes. So we're going to say to the police, we're going to take 100 people, or let's use the example of the 20. We're going to take the 20 people that you see all the time. And without interventions, how many times you're going to see them in the next year. You know that. And because what is predictable is also preventable. And so we're going to support them, and then you're going to pay us for reduction in the amount and the number of times you're going to see them over the next year. So that's what the contract looks like. We go and line up the financing, usually from, we like working with foundations because they're mission aligned, and they should be investing in us because we're delivering not just the financial benefits, but also these social benefits on their money. We use the money to provide the Lucy's Place supportive housing, which causes a reduction in the use of police services and police dispatches and arrests. And then we send them an invoice and they pay us. And what's cool about this model is that we can do it because what the mayor is saying is the 43 contacts per year per person it's police, fire, ambulance, healthcare system, 2 places in the justice system, both courts and incarceration, and shelters. So it's a really transparent, outcomes-oriented way of selling to governments these what it is that they really need. And anyways, you can read it in the beautiful bailout how that kind of looks. And here's a couple quick examples. And I love this example because it's clean and easy. In Israel, there's a nonprofit that's working with 1,000 pre-diabetics, and they're getting paid based on the number of pre-diabetics that don't become diabetic over 5 years. So Aki, I helped start a social enterprise called Aki Foods, and we're copying this example. We're going to take 1,000 people in the Ojibwe nations of Manitoba, and we're going to volunteers, and we're going to poke them to get their blood sugar levels at the beginning of 5 years and then at the end, and we'll get paid based on the reduction in blood sugar levels over 5 years by both the government of Canada and the government of Manitoba Health. Now, Aki Energy, which I also helped to start, our plan is to do $200 million worth of ground source heat pumps on First Nations in Manitoba with 100% on reserve labor. But there's all kinds of benefits that come out of this, right? There's reductions in social assistance because we're hiring people off social assistance. There's environmental benefits, Manitoba hydro benefits. So what we're doing is we're signing procurement agreements with all of these different government systems and charging them for the things that are relevant to them. So Manitoba Hydro couldn't care less how many Indigenous people we're hiring on First Nations, but they sure as the hell do care about not having to install a new substation there because the community's growing so quickly. So we just kind of sell them the thing that matters to them most. And when you combine like half of the benefits across all these systems, it's more than what Aki Energy needs. And then here's the Redwood Park communities in Barrie and the idea of selling what supportive housing does to governments. So that's a bit, just a taste of social procurement. So we've talked about a couple things. I just want to keep them kind of like so they're clear. So there's the build is selling to Manitoba Housing and other nonprofit housing providers things that they're already buying and have huge budgets, $90 million a year forever to maintain their housing stock. And so beautiful. It's how we traditionally think about social procurement. But we've got to begin to also figure out ways of selling to government things that they desperately need that we're now not offering. And things like a reduction in police arrests or police workload, or a reduction in court appearances. And it's social procurement, but we're able to value what the secret sauce of what it is that we offer. And that's 14 years of my head getting twisted upside down. And if we haven't met before, I apologize, because you just had 14 years of my head getting twisted around into a very short presentation.
It's awesome. Thank you, Shaun. I know that Ashley has added a question into the chat, and we want to definitely open it up for others. We have about 15 minutes to, think about your own role, your position, the organization you're working in, and let's hear questions that people have. But I'll pass it over to you, Ashley, to ask your question next.
And we just had a whole thing about that. I just wanted to say thank you, Shaun. It's always such a delight to hear you talk. And I've been writing down notes the whole time, and you always just end up touching on it. And by the end, I don't even have that many questions. But the one that came up was, how do we find a balance between building the capacity of these organizations and social enterprises so that they can be awarded these government contracts instead of being subcontractors? Because I'm just worried about, making social enterprises and diverse suppliers vulnerable to exploitation of labor, in the way where it's okay, we're going to award this bigger company with a large piece of the pie, and then we're just going to check off a box and have an Indigenous company do the drywall. And then, how do we you talked about this social procurement clause, and how do we have it mandated that the goal is to one day have social enterprises be the main contractor awarded and not just the subcontractor, so we don't fall into that trap of them just using.
I think and what they do in Scotland is they have, that's a different word they use, and I've been having trouble remembering this word, but it's like an amalgamator.
Mm-hmm.
So they'll say, okay, well, we'll be the general contractor, the amalgamator. They'll hire that expertise, and then they'll go and subcontract to all, so that the entire hospital pretty much can be built by social enterprises. But they're a long ways ahead of us, and there's a lot of capacity in the social enterprise sector that's there. But that was the idea of how they set up some of those. I think, though, and Robert did a good job of kind of describing how contracting generally works, to stick with that example, and it is in the policy itself. So unless it's changed, the last I read, Toronto's social procurement policy is exactly what you're talking about. It's like exploitation, because what they're saying to procurement officers, you must have social enterprises, you must offer you must get a social enterprise bid on all contracts.
Mm-hmm.
What? So first of all, you have us competing against each other, which is against our ethos. And then secondly, you're still not valuing the social outcome.
Exactly.
Manitoba Housing is at least valuing it, not in money terms, but valuing it in terms of you get first dibs on the contracts because you're doing stuff that our regular suppliers can't.
Yeah.
So I think it's all in how it's set up, right? We will always be pressing against these systems and trying to get procurement done in the right way. But I think that's also the value of the second piece that I showed you around the outcomes purchasing, because what's cool there is instead of having 100 nonprofits doing something, spreading funding around a little bit here and there and not really wondering if any of them are moving the needle, they only get paid based on outcomes. Mm-hmm. So if you don't reduce the number of arrests and nights in jail for that cohort of 20 people that the police chief sees on a regular basis, then you don't get paid. So it really gears everything towards outcomes, but it also really gears, because the money's coming from investors, usually foundations, they want their money back. It's not a granting relationship, it's an investment relationship. And so that process means that the outcomes must be valued. So it's like, no, police, we know that those 20 people are 10% of your workload. So if we take out that 10% of the workload, you're going to pay us some version of 10% of your budget.
Yeah.
And the cool thing about that is that when you do value, is that now we're going to go on to not people who are homeless necessarily, but we're going to go and work with gang involved people, because you're seeing them an awful lot too. But you need to value all those outcomes. So yeah, watch out for exploitation, and if the outcomes are valued, you can pay the $15 an hour or the apprenticeship wages or do all the things that you need to do. But the social enterprises that are struggling, you'll find they're usually giving away their outcomes.
Yeah, and ideally with some of these requirements that you had, like that one place where they said we mainly hire people with a record, like that's the only way. But then they're also suppliers for police forces. So ideally over time, we should be seeing a reduction in numbers of people with criminal records, because they are being employed, instead of it being like more people have records so that they can also supply this need. So yeah. I like the model of us always shifting to a new problem that we need to solve, instead of just regenerating like this cycle of service.
Right.
Thank you.
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of nuances in all of this, which are important, like really understanding how money moves inside government. But we've got 4 different cabinet ministers from Doug Ford's government, like their offices calling us now on a regular basis because of the work in Barrie. Like, I think but we're not going to them and telling them that they're wrong about their conservatism or their socialism or in a different context. We're going through their own lens, right? And saying the systems are broken. You know, Doug Ford would agree with that. The systems are broken. The solution's entrepreneurial. Yeah, now you're talking. It's going to be a business approach. That's right. It's going to be a business approach. Hey, we've got all those things here, right? So we need to reorient these systems away from the expensive managing of problems towards the less expensive solving of the problems. And both social procurement, as we traditionally understand it, and the selling of outcomes. But you can't, like, the selling of outcomes it's not taking what we're doing now and then just it's a much more, the process is much more involved with that, and really involves focusing the solution on providing services to the cohort. So, you know, in Island Lake region of Manitoba, where we're doing this, Aki Foods is doing the diabetes reduction. It's made a total change in how Aki Foods is operating, both in scale, and we're now doing, going to be doing maternal health care. We never were doing that before. It really involves changing, just so we make sure we're moving the needle on the blood sugar levels so that we can get paid.
Yeah.
And I think embedded in my answer there is why social return on investment isn't something governments are paying attention to, because it's really a tool to try to make a case for funding. Mm-hmm. And funding is not if you can get funding, go for it, but it's not a good tool to scale your solution or scale your business.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I know Robert mentioned that he had a question, but also just wanted to open it up if there was anybody who hadn't asked their question yet, or if there's any of the others in the chat that I need to get to. Is there anybody else that wanted to jump in with a question?
Yeah, thank you. And again, thanks for everyone for tolerating my enthusiasm. But this is something like this is extremely cool because I see social enterprise. It's a gradient between free market solutions, the previously disparate, or what the conception of what people would previously or otherwise think are disparate free market solutions versus like charitable handouts. Because I don't know, I've just seen so much, like having gone from family business, construction, hyper competitive, all profit stuff, and just getting very sick of seeing how all that's done and the greed and the terrible outcomes that it leads to. And then working in government and seeing the unbelievable amount of bureaucracy and hypocrisy. Like those are both different kinds of shit. Sorry. And like, it's weird, but like no one says so. Like on one side, it's like, hey, you know who's really good? I don't know, Republicans. And the other side, it's like, yeah, you know who's really the opposite of that. But it's like, no one wins when you're having, like, no one wins, but it's a constant versus. And again, if you can just focus on outcomes, the actual solving of the problem is the thing. It's not my team is better than yours. Anyways, when I said my question about incentivization and outcomes, in the past year, I've seen an incredible amount of government grants that have become available to cultural institutions. And what bugs me as a taxpayer is that all of these grants, well, nearly all of these grants, were being given away, like the government is begging you to take the money. And the individuals and the ministries that are in charge of giving out the money, their only incentive is that by the end of the month, that money is given out.
The outcome is the beginning of the money.
That's it. That's exactly it. So when you said that that funding model is colonial, that makes total sense. Because what it's saying is, oh, well, here are these people who are incapable of helping themselves. Let us dispense cheap bread and circuses to them such that they will be satiated. That way, I can tick off my, oh yeah, we've allocated this much funding to the indigenous, this much funding to the disenfranchised, and now I can sleep easy. Mm-hmm. And anyways, I've noticed that there's a tremendous amount of hypocrisy there, because like a ministry will say, hey, we'll give you $20,000 and you don't have to write a report about where this goes. But I'm going to be after you to make sure that you take the money. Please give us your banking information.
Yeah, so they're usually focused on outputs in a funding relationship. And what we need them to focus on is outcomes. What happens to your systems as a result of your interacting with us? Yeah. Certainly.
And then what happens there? Yes, taxpayers should love the outcomes approach. Absolutely. Mm-hmm. One of my mandates at the museum, it was reducing our budget significantly so that we don't have to get grants. And so that if grants were available, the museum could become an aggregator to funnel that money to local people who could start enterprise, and then it would get to the community. Otherwise, what I've noticed is it leads to a bloating of government. And I don't think an oversized government that doles things out is the solution. What you said that the government should be in the problem-solving business, really it's the facilitation side of things.
It doesn't mean, I'm not saying government shouldn't be paying, because if we're reducing, the example in Manitoba I like to use, there's 10,000 Indigenous kids in care in our little province. Jesus Christ.
Enormous.
And almost no supports for the parents. So if child welfare agencies do family reunification, and there's great examples, 80% success rates at a fraction of the cost of reuniting families, keeping kids in care, they're financially punished. They get less money because they're paid on a per kid in care basis. So I'm not saying, ignore government and just go and do it on our own. No. If you're paying $80,000 per kid in care per year, you can damn well pay $30,000 per kid that we successfully get back with their parents through these Indigenous solutions. So, but funding isn't something that it's good to try something out or develop a business case or to do some research or demonstration, but it's just not good for scaling solutions. Hi, Nicole.
Hey there. How are you?
Good. Nice to see you again.
Yeah, it's always a pleasure to hear your conversations and your presentation. I always really enjoy it. So thank you.
Thanks.
Yeah, I was just gonna weigh in a little bit there, if you don't mind, on that thought. Just to kind of something that you said about the entrepreneur piece, and I don't know if this dovetails into this conversation for Rob, but I think this project, for me, anyways, my interpretation of what we're doing with it is really about allowing people to have a locus of control to make some of those decisions from where they sit. And so what's great about this project and some of the things that you're working on is you're actually giving power and change agents to procurers. And so what I think that's great about that is when we talk about the systems change piece, is you're seeding a grassroots approach internally to people that maybe before didn't know if they had the tools or the resources to do it. And I think what's really great about that is it's part of that system shift narrative you're talking about. Like the systems operate the way they're designed, right? Like all the stuff that we see and the things that we're doing, they were designed that way, that colonial mindset. And so what I think is so great about this collaboration is that we're allowing that change agent to happen from within, secretly, silently, and really positive ways, right? So anyways, I just wanted to sort of circle back around to that because I think there's a lot of hope in sort of this approach. It'll take time, but I also think it's very empowering because it really allows an individual to have agency, in a time, in a space maybe where they didn't feel like they had that before. So anyways, I just wanted to kind of drop that in and I thought that was a great takeaway. So I just wanted to share that. So. Yeah,
I think it's kind of what Robert's saying. I think that this is a process of talking to people through their values, not their ideology. And, we're really mixing up the political paradigm as people generally understand it. And I think that you talk to procurement officers and you tell them, it's like, okay, you're responsible for buying new police cars every year. Do you think you could buy a reduction in your fleet, or could you buy a reduction in the need for those police cars? Like, absolutely. All I need is a memo, and we'll buy it, and we'll get a contract. They understand it very well because that's what they do. They buy stuff, but what they really need, we're just beginning to figure out how to sell it to them. And it's not social impact bonds. It's not. Like, that's a private sector investment tool that's being brought into the solution sector, and it just doesn't work. Government doesn't even understand it, but they sure as hell understand procurement. And Elly, I was mentioning to you that where I worked, a social enterprise called Encompass Co-op, we have a movie coming out, and don't judge me. It's a comedy. It's 18 minutes long, and it's got a little bit of The Office in it, but it follows a life of an executive director of a nonprofit who wants to reduce incarceration and her interactions with a civil servant that cares and wants to see the world made into a better place. And so we hope to have a screening with Senko, and you can all come. And I make a cameo in it. I was written into it, but I got nervous, and so I got myself out of having even a minor role in it. But it's called Broke, the business of systems change, and it's like 98% done. We're just kind of touching it up right now. We're pretty proud of it. That's amazing. Yeah, we would love to do a screening. I can't wait.
That sounds awesome, Shaun. Thank you. I see there's definitely still some comments in the chat, but I also know we're hitting our time. So I just wanted to give like a huge thank you to you, Shaun. It's always amazing to hear what you have to say, and yeah, we just really appreciate it. And thanks to everybody on the call for listening, participating, and hopefully digesting all of this in your own work.